Hello, everybody. All right, so this lecture will be on information architecture to give you an overview of what this means and how we go about this in the human computer interaction space. So, first, what is information architecture? Most simply, it's a practice of organizing content in an app or a website. Typically born from library science, I'll often refer people to librarians or library science trained folks in their domain or in their communities to help out on anything that's overly complex or to verify what we're doing. They're still trained in information architecture in their education, so it helps ensure users can find what they need when they need it. So here's just a couple examples. I just snipped this from Amazon. So if you hit the hamburger menu, you will see all of these different departments and see how they have these bold headings. That's their first layer, right? That's their top level organization, we'd say. And then below that, they have other options. And then if you click the clothing, shoes, jewelry, and watches, it expands over to this. So since you selected that, that becomes your new top level heading. And then these are the sub options that they have for that. Notice you also have a return to main menu UI element, which is super important for a lot of these websites and applications so that you can have navigation in both directions. All right, so 8 principles of AI. This came from a paper, more, I guess, it's not a poster per se, but it's a short paper, maybe 3 to 5 pages, depending on the version you look at, by Dan Brown, and he sets forth the 8 principles of information architecture. So similar to other design principles we've looked at, whether that's the Nielsen's heuristics or Norman's rules of UX design or those things. It's similar in that way. So you want to think of these as somewhat abstract expectations that your information architecture will have. And it's important to remember also that information architecture is a conceptual thing. It's abstract. There isn't really, unlike a lot of other UX or HCI type tasks, there's not really a lot of deliverables for these things. Your information architecture tends to pop up throughout the design process. And with that, and like with information architecture, so a lot of people will sometimes mix up information architecture with a sitemap. And if you're familiar with a sitemap is typically a list of all the content on a site. And it depends. So obviously, a very complex site like, let's say, an Amazon.com, you're not going to get every single element on a sitemap. They might have one behind the scenes, but when you click sitemap, you're probably not going to find that. But a more simple website might have that. And what's important to understand is a sitemap is not an information architecture. It's an artifact that manifests the information architecture, but it also doesn't do it in kind of any like user focused or interactive way. So it's just the list of the content, which again can be valuable and is necessary, but information architecture transcends just the scaffolding of information. It's also how we digest information, traverse through it, and select it. So going back to these 8 principles, though, so first you have the object principle. So we think of content as a living object with its life cycle, behavior, and attributes. So with that, we're looking at, so when you're considering a piece of content in your site, let's say it's a team listing. Okay, that listing of team members becomes an object. which is quite a bit different, right? Than the other direction where we think, okay, we have a bunch of team members, and now we're going to make a list of them. This kind of takes, it, I guess, manifests an importance to that list. You have the choice principle, so offer a focused set of relevant choices for users on every page. That's the don't give them access to everything at every page, because that'll overwhelm your users, increase cognitive load, and just overall drag on the experience. Then we have the disclosure principle, so only show users what they need if they want to keep digging. So this is where you will see sometimes sites. It's not as common now where we have phone and touch interfaces, but there was a time where you would your hover pop-ups, your tooltips, would show you a little bit more about what it was asking you to do. Example principle, so when possible, use content examples to show users what's in that category. One of the more important ones, in my opinion, is the front door principle. So ensure your site is easy to navigate even if users don't land on your site's homepage. This is really, really important, especially in the ubiquitous age of computing where everything's connected to everything. So you always want to make sure that you acknowledge that a lot of your users will not show up on your landing page. That's not how they'll get to you. And so in that sense, there's the brute force way of everything goes to the landing page. But realistically, what you want to do is to essentially consider that interaction and plan for it. So this is where you'll get sticky menus or different things like that, or that bottom footer that's in almost every website, right? That's become a known design feature so that we know as users that if we feel lost, we can always go down to the very, very bottom or the very, very top and usually find what we need, like at least a way to get home. Multiple classification principles. So provide different ways for your users to search through your site's content. This links a lot with the object principle, where you're going to define your objects and there will be overlap. They will have their own characteristics and things. And so you want to enable that kind of cross-pollination. Focus navigation. So make sure your navigation aids are consistent. That's a big one in design, especially UI design, right? We want, if we're going to use a certain type of menu, we want to use that menu throughout whenever possible. And growth principles. So as you're developing your information architecture, it needs to be flexible enough to scale as you step up more and more content and develop that. If you're more interested in more information about these, there's a lot of articles out there. If you just search 8 principles of information architecture. You can also, I believe it's free online to get Dan Brown's initial publication where he explains it a little bit more as well. So here's an example I wanted to show for object-oriented UX. So if there's any programmers around, object-oriented, that rings a bell. As software became more and more complex, object-oriented programming became a thing that enabled you to essentially deconstruct that complexity into distinct components, and it brought simplicity or different benefits to that process. So there's a version of that in UX called object-oriented UX, and this isn't just an information architecture thing, but it tends to show up in IA probably more than in other UX concerns. So in an object-oriented UX example, you're organizing your system by nouns instead of verbs. So objects over actions, and this, that's a typo. That should be OOUX versus IXD. So the object-oriented UX would be the foil to interaction design. As UX designers, we tend to think in terms of actions. Our users have a story. We're doing a user journey. Personas, they want to do certain things. And that's valuable and can lead to great interfaces. But there are instances where you may not want to have, or you may not need the action first orientation, or it could be negative possibly. So it could lead to, let's say, varying experiences. If you're saying, well, if we treat each action path as distinct, then we may have a harder time creating a cohesive user experience, especially in more complex or data intensive areas. So, and keep in mind, this isn't like a one is better than the other. They're separate tools for separate things. But in this, we use objects, attributes, and actions to separate out the content. And I have an example here for like a project management app. So objects would be your projects, tasks, clients. Attributes are names, clients, descriptions. Actions, create, delete, view, or edit. And these are just basic ones. Now, what does this look like in an information architecture? So this is just, again, an example. And so you might have, here's your objects. Project has specific actions. You can use modals, which are a kind of intermediary characteristic, let's say, of the element. And then we have more actions. Down here we get into attributes. So this is just one example of kind of how this will flow if you're using an object-oriented user experience approach, where, for example, in an interaction design context, we would be very focused on the actions and then would extrapolate out to essentially the objects, attributes, and data that would be needed to satisfy those actions. And that's kind of that differentiation. But you'll sometimes see that as in different IA spaces where people will embrace more of an object-oriented approach. So why would you use object-oriented UX? So sometimes the action first approach is not effective. We talked about that. So you may get different experiences. You may miss core connections. Again, it's one of those things of we want the user to guide design at every step of the way, which a lot of times involves fighting our own assumptions. And when we take an action first approach, we are making an assumption. Object-oriented UX may increase collaboration between designers and developers. This is an interesting one because developers tend to be more familiar with an object-oriented philosophy. This might, just gel with them better. If you're a developer, put in a comment or something, and does that make sense? And mainly it helps manage overly complex or data-heavy environments. That's the principles that led to its birth in programming are similar in design, where it just can be a beneficial step to take. Now, IA methods specifically, so there are, because it's an abstract, kind of ever-going concept, every method really can apply in some sense, but the main ones, right, will use standard UX methods like personas, user testing, and think alouds. I've found are very, very effective at capturing IA related kind of understandings, because users will click something and then say, oh, that's not what I thought that would do, or oh, I was looking for this. And those are, big red flags of IA related tasks. But then there are information architecture specific ones as well. So the two main ones are card sorting and tree testing. So with a card sort, you are basically asking users to build hierarchies or taxonomies of information. An open card sort is when you give them all the cards and allow them to create new ones, and they're free to develop those hierarchies kind of however they wish. A closed is when some aspects of that card sorting hierarchy are fixed. So you might fix that top level and then you want to know where they're going to put all the sub elements. Or you can have a hybrid approach, which is typically what I prefer to do. because you can have it both ways in essence. So that can be an interesting approach. Uh, I will say that the data you get from a card sort, you may want to dig in a little bit more on kind of how to interpret that data. It is slightly different than what we're used to. And then tree testing is an interesting one where you actually provide your information architecture to the user and they kind of click through your menus with links and we'll see, and then we see if they get everywhere they need to get. That can be an also very effective methodology for testing an information architecture. All right, well, that's kind of our brief overview of information architecture. Because it's a more abstract concept, there's really a lot of different angles to it, which makes it incredibly interesting and incredibly important for your website and application. Um, but it's one of those things where it's very important, and there aren't a ton of fixed kind of recipe style processes to follow to get to it. So, um, but feel free to explore out there. There's a lot of other resources on information architecture and different examples and case studies that can be helpful in how it kind of manifests itself. All right, thanks.